All righty. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Emily Anthony, Managing Director of Centerstone Executive Search and Consulting, and I'm calling here from Philadelphia. And I'd like to welcome all of you to our first webinar in our Best Practices in Executive Talent Management series. Today, we have the privilege of hearing from 3 Chief Diversity Officers from global retail and manufacturing companies. Our webinar today is going to be 1 hour. 45 minutes of that will be dedicated to hearing from our speakers, and we've reserved 15 minutes at the end to address questions from our audience. We invite you to ask questions to our panelists, and to do so, locate the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen. If you're having technical difficulties, please use the dial-in information provided in your invite, as well as the chat window that's posted to your right. As a note, our program today is going to be recorded. And at this point, I'd love to introduce you to our moderator for this webinar, Centerstone's founder and CEO, Dr. Kim Villeneuve.
Thank you, Emily. The topic of diversity and inclusion practices just couldn't be more timely today, and particularly as we're experiencing the most recent outcry for racial equality and for genuine inclusion. It's really an issue that touches our society, and it also touches our businesses as well. So it's a topic that we've been passionate about for a very long time. So it's really an honor to be able to pull our panel together and have a conversation about it. As executive search partners, we've had a commitment that 100% of our search slates will be diverse candidates or have diversity candidates on those slates. And that over time is reflected over a 33% placement rate of diverse candidates. And of those 33%, 20% of them have been promotable within the first 2 years. We think that diversity is absolutely critical to look at from the very beginning stages of talent acquisition all the way through the talent management process. So we're excited today to introduce you to 3 panelists who I know fairly well, and also have had the opportunity to spend some time on this topic in preparation for our conversation today. First is Kristen Weirick. She's the Global Talent Acquisition and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer at Alcon. Kristen and I actually met at United Airlines. She also came before that from AbbVie, Cargill, Whirlpool, and she has a BA from Oakland University. Next is Treasa Bowers. She's the Chief Diversity Officer at 7-Eleven and has been for quite a good time. And before that, she had a really distinguished career with Women's Food Service Forum. She has a BS from Kennedy Western. And Lance Lavergne, he's the Chief Diversity Officer and Senior VP of Global Talent Acquisition and also Associate Experience at PVH. He came from Wells Fargo. He has got a background also from Alcoa, New York Life, Goldman Sachs. He has his MBA from NYU and his BA from Harvard University. So I'd like to start by asking each of the panelists 2 questions that I think are foundational really to our conversation today. The first question for each of you is, in what ways has your personal life experiences informed your passion for this work? And I'd love to start with Kristen and then go to Treasa and Lance. So just kind of in a nutshell, how has your life experience informed your work here and your passion?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually grew up in a very small town in the western part of New York State, and to put it mildly, it was not diverse. So at all. I didn't even have a glimmer of what diversity was, but my mother made some very smart choices when we were young. She was getting her master's degree in downtown Buffalo, and she chose to take my sister and I to the YWCA in downtown Buffalo for childcare. And in that situation, we were the ones, my sister and I were the ones who were completely diverse. And that was, the first experience I had. And I think it formed a lot lot of, because, when you're kids, you don't think about it. It's just, these are my friends. These are the people I hang out with every day. So it was my first kind of experience with diversity. But then she also had us travel significantly. So, I mean, in the 70s, I was in the USSR. We traveled to all sorts of, kind of crazy places to see the world. And then when I was 17, I moved to South America, where I didn't speak Spanish, but I ended up staying there for 4 years and just being, and actually I thought I was going to live the rest of my life in South America. Things changed and I ended up coming back to the States. But it really did help me form a global perspective and a deeper understanding of, people are people and how they deserve to be treated regardless of race, ethnicity, and any other forms of diversity that are out there. And which is why I feel so passionate about this space, because, we all deserve respect, integrity, and the opportunity to succeed.
Well, interesting, Kristen, you and I share something of a similar orientation, at least as it relates to the homogenous backgrounds of the places where we were born and raised. So I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, a very homogenous or a place to live with, certainly some wonderful attributes, but I started my career in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I was most definitely, all too often, the only woman often in my role, the only Black or person of color in my role, and oftentimes the youngest in my role. That's an experience, but the juxtaposition or the alternative experience is what I grew up with in the other side of my upbringing, and that is the daughter of a career military man and living on military bases, having the exposure to all sorts of ethnicities and cultures, and just the experience of having a sense of belonging, the need that we knew we had of one another to create that community, despite our differences. And I was not as cognizant of it as I was young, certainly became more cognizant as I got older. And during my initial professional career, I think those early on experiences really helped me to navigate that workplace, homogenous workplace environment as I did. Now at this life stage, what's really important to me, having experienced microaggressions, having experienced bigotry, but also having experienced sponsorship and mentorship, is the aspirational goal of making some sustainable pathways forward for the many, not just the few. And it's become a personal imperative of mine. Before I sunset my career, I want to know that I've done something impactful in that way. Sounds a little bit egotistical, but it really is more of a heart thing at this point for me.
Well, one of the things I love about these types of sessions is that, you find points of connection. I too am a military brat, Air Force brat, born in Elmendorf Air Force Base. I got married in Buffalo. Both of my in-laws were public school administrators in Buffalo. I came to this work a little later. I thought I was going to be an investment banker or have a career in sales and trading and all that sort of stuff. Took a little bit of a detour and began working in executive search, and then ultimately had joined McKinsey and Company as to help them build out a new recruiting function. And I was talking to an analyst, and I tell this story all the time, and I wish I knew the name of this analyst. We were talking about engagements and what was interesting and what was not. And this 23-year-old analyst was saying that the most important thing to them was working on engagements that had impact for the organization. Otherwise, it's just busy work, and why do you do it? And what struck me about that conversation is I'm in my mid-30s, I've been working for all these years, and had never thought about what I do from an impact perspective. And Treasa, you mentioned it. And so, that kind of stuck with me, and, we went on about our business there at McKinsey. And then I got a call about an opportunity at Goldman to work in diversity. And as I thought more about that job at Goldman Sachs, which, arguably was one of the best firms in its business, but it had issues and things it was trying to accomplish from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And the opportunity was to go there and make a difference, not only to the organization, but to the people who would benefit from the work that you would be doing. And so in 2000, I left McKinsey and went to Goldman and have been on a D&I journey that is both D&I and talent acquisition ever since. And I ran away from this work earlier on in my career because I reached out. When you're one of the few in your organization and they need somebody to represent diversity, you get the call. And prior to this experience, I was like, please don't call me just because I'm the Black guy. I don't want to be your diversity poster child. It was a terribly uninformed perspective I have come to appreciate. Because now I make those calls and tell people to get involved. But it's because this work makes such a difference. And I can't imagine doing anything different.
Thank you. I think that's so valuable just to hear from where you come. And I think there's one more thing that sort of is a foundational conversation piece here, and that is, it's sort of the elephant in the room right now, and it's around Black Lives Matter, and it's around really what's happening in terms of our society today, where we find ourselves, and just the outcry, honestly. So my question to you, and I'd love for you to start, Lance, and then Treasa, and then Kristen. My question to you is, how would you characterize the evolution of DE&I over the last 5 or so years? And how has it taken a big right turn now, given that we're going through really this epiphany of sorts right before our very eyes, and in such an emotional, societal way? How's it impacting your business and how you look at diversity, inclusion, and belonging?
Sure. What is interesting, I've been doing this, like I said, since about 2000, and the nomenclature changes and the words change, partly because people get a little fatigued and they want to try and, approach it from a different angle or whatever. But ultimately, fundamentally, it's still the same work, trying to create access to opportunity for those who have historically been denied that opportunity. And that can take a whole variety of forms. I do think, though, that one of the ways that we've seen some positive evolution is that it went from, diversity, just having different people in the mix, which is great because that's the first step to getting people to have that opportunity. But once they're there, often they found themselves marginalized. And so I'm at the table, but no one's talking to me. No one's serving me my meal. I just may as well go home and open up my can of pork and beans and call it a day. Inclusion is about really actually letting people participate in the process and have access to those opportunities that you brought them there in the first place. And then ultimately, it's getting to the point, and we may talk about this later, where you actually feel like you belong. You're an owner, you're a participant. You not only deserve a seat at the table, but it has your name on it, and you can bring other people to the party as well. And so that's part of, as I see the evolution of how we think about it differently. So that, again, we probably will use this word over and over again, but it's impact, having meaningful impact for all of the stakeholders in the work that we do. I think right now we're in an interesting time where the emphasis is really on the Black community, particularly here in the US, but globally as well, given all that we've been seeing happening, especially in elevating the issues around racial and social injustice, and seeing an enormous wave of interest and allyship happening around this topic. And the one thing that I'll say, and I'll turn it over to the other panelists, to me, what has been really great about some of the things that have emerged from this is that Black people in their organizations seem to have collectively said, I have got to use my voice now. I have kind of tried to manage my existence and kind of go along and assimilate. But given what's going on in the in the environment and seeing how other people are leveraging their voice and platform, I need to do the same thing in the areas and arenas where I operate. And I hadn't seen that kind of energy before among Black employees and organizations. And to me, that is what will lead to some meaningful and sustained change.
I think for my observation is that DEI has migrated from a focus on representation from diversity in some typical demographic senses, that's race or ethnicity or gender, to then an evolution to inclusion of, so from a seat at the table to having a voice. And now, much like Lance just stated, from having a voice to having that voice heard. And what I think BLM has done has caused those voices to be much more audible. They're much more animated and compelling. And as a result of that, I think that there are honest conversations that are taking place. In some cases, hard conversations that are taking place within the workplace by leaders who are in an organic and authentic way, setting the stage for people of color, Black and brown and others, to share their experiences. And because that sharing is taking place, understanding is taking place. And because understanding is taking place, I do believe that we are on the precipice of a different kind of change taking place. And I certainly will tell you, sitting in the seat of Chief Diversity Officer, I'm experiencing a different level of personal accountability from folks. So I think that's a change.
Yeah, so I'll add my 2 cents. I couldn't agree more with Lance and Treasa. Going back 5 years ago, I think there was, to their point, a kind of a focus on the numbers as opposed to really leading with inclusion. But it was, it was that thing that companies do, the kind of the check the box, here's the things that we're going to do. I mean, I remember, and I've never viewed it that way, but I remember I was trying to recruit someone to my team, and they were within the organization, and they said, quote, D&I is where HR people go to die. And I was like I couldn't believe that's how they viewed it, because I'm like, you don't get the power and the opportunity that is involved in leading a D&I function and driving this, kind of foundational change in terms of how we operate. So I do think what has happened most recently with BLM is now organizations, I mean, we are some of the most popular people in organizations right now. There is just a huge demand for the expertise on how to drive things. And what I'm seeing is just an incredible increase in appetite and engagement around it. And I think there's a kind of a push and a pull, or a plus and a minus to that, because there is this huge appetite. There's this huge demand for increased learning. But with that is this momentum that we want to take advantage of, is there's this concern of a pause. That is this kind of the, we're going over the top of the hill, and we're just going to go back down to where we were before. And one of the things I'm seeing, I made a comment on LinkedIn that someone was, saying, we need blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wait, we don't need more people of color to say things aren't right. We need more people like me to say, hey, things aren't right, and here's how we're going to address it and change it and move the needle. Because it's not more folks of color, raising their hand and saying, I want things to be different.
Thank you. Lance, when we were chatting in preparation, you talked about the societal benefit of DE&I, and then you also talked about sort of the real commercial and business value of increased productivity, engagement, belonging. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Early on, in the work, the big thing was to establish what's your business case for diversity, as if you had to convince people why this is important work. And fortunately, you don't seem to have that conversation as much. It's become obvious, particularly in consumer-oriented businesses. I mean, you get it. We get the people side of it. We get the marketplace side of it. And so to me, those two are really central to driving the work that we do and why it makes good business sense. The first with your people, if you've got an engaged workforce, if you've got people who are expending discretionary effort, that's how your organization is going to win and outdo the competition. And the way you get people to want to invest their time and energy in your organization is by making them feel that they are truly a part of that organization, that they're valued, that they're heard, that their contributions will be rewarded, and that they make a difference there. And that's really what belonging is all about. This place is mine. I am of this place, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it succeed. And then on the marketplace side of it, it's really establishing that the considerations around inclusion and diversity are a part of how you think about engaging with your customer base, your stakeholder base. And so that even your consumers, the people to whom you are providing goods and services, feel like they are a part of their organization. They can see themselves in you, and then they be for whatever it is, the economic decision that they're making relative to your organization. So it can actually be both the
I'm going to move on and we'll have Emily help us figure this out. Thank you. So one of the things that Lance is talking about is really this distinction between inclusion and belonging, because a lot of people get it confused, but it really is belonging that increases this engagement that we're looking for. And that's where a lot of the benefit comes internally. When I was talking to you, Kristen, I was delighted when I heard you say this: altruism is not a strategy. Can you start us off by talking about how do you set up a strategy for DE&I? And then we're going to talk more specifically about what is in that strategy and how can the organizations that are listening in today start to really wrap their heads around creating a real strategy with actionable imperatives.
Yeah, so my altruism isn't a strategy is, I think we've relied on that for far too long, that if people are just good people and they, they're going to want to do the right thing, that everything will just kind of work out. And it's clear it has not worked that way because there's a lot of good people out there. And what happens is they just, they don't know what to do. And this whole space of diversity and inclusion it's complex, because when you talk about diversity and inclusion, it's, different races, different ethnicities, different genders, just different sexual orientations. There is not a one size fits all approach to this space. And that's what a lot of organizations try to create in terms of their strategy, and ends up being very generic and maybe pushing the needle in some places, but not in others. So when I look at strategy around DE&I, I'm a big fan of data and really digging deep into the metrics and understanding what does your data tell you, and what that data informs should inform your strategy. So when I look at within the US, we'll talk about, I will look at what is the representation in your organization by specific level, by specific classes. And then I will look at what is the true market availability of that talent in the external market, not what is the population of a certain class, but in that specific, let's say R&D in healthcare industries, that's what I want to know, is what is the market availability, because that can then inform you can look at the data and say, is this a sourcing problem I have if I am not at the representation I should have? Is this a sourcing problem I have? Is this a selection problem that I have? Is this a development problem that I have? Is this a retention problem that I have? Is it a little bit of a bunch of things mixed together? Most probably yes. But then you're designing a strategy that is focused on a specific area of the business, on the specific needs of that business. And so you're much more laser focused, and you're much more likely to have the type of impact that you want.
Mm-hmm. I love the fact that you are connecting data, because I think that it goes back to the difference between feeling good about the fact that we're doing great things, as opposed to we have data to back that up, and that is part of the strategy. I think that's so powerful. Treasa, when you and I were chatting, I loved the sort of imperatives that you were looking at and that have made you successful in leading this. And one of the things you talked about that was really interesting is that you spoke of diversity as a tapestry. And then you talked about mentoring being a foundational piece of a plan and strategy to actually execute great diversity. Can you talk more about that?
Well, yeah. So for those of you who have are feelings oriented or more emote responsive, that this might appeal to you. It's interesting to me that this is something that resonates with me, because I'm actually more of a control responsive person, much more logic in my approach. But when I think about what a tapestry is, it's woven fabric, threads that are woven together and create art. It's not one-dimensional, and it is valuable. And when I think about diversity, the true evolution and visibility of diversity, what I think about is life experiences as threads being woven together to create something that's unique and valuable. I think about that in business. If we are unique, we are able to achieve something extraordinary. When you're in a growth-oriented business like I am, we have to be able to figure out what's going to differentiate us in the future. And it's only going to be through our talent that we're able to do that. And then if I think about just mentoring in general, mentoring ideally is that matching, that chemistry that occurs where credibility and rapport and trust evolve into influence, and that influence helps one to develop and navigate. I've been on the receiving end of mentoring. I have been, and I'm a mentor, and I tell you that I have developed, and I'm still developing to this day from mentoring relationships. And I think that it's a fundamental element to helping people have that experience of belonging that we've been talking about so far this morning. The way in which those unique experiences create that clarity of voice and values, and then understanding where those voice and values fit in the organization, and also having the encouragement to push when they don't exactly fit, but they're still very necessary. And I think mentoring is a pathway to that.
Thank you. And Kristen, when you and I chatted, you said something really interesting about conscious bias, and you talked about going from conscious bias to conscious inclusion, from conscious inclusion to unconscious inclusion. Tell us about this.
Sorry if you hear noise in the background. I've got some workers at the house, so I apologize for that. Hopefully you can still hear me. So many organizations look at unconscious bias training as like a salve over the diversity and inclusion space. And I love the D&I practitioners who are like, nope. So all of the research tells us that Unconscious bias training does not change behavior. Where the behavior change comes is, you've got unconscious bias. Let's say you take you go out and you take the implicit awareness test. You go through some, training. You're like, oh, okay, I got this thing. Like I have a preference toward X, Y, or Z. And that's usually where it ends. The real heavy lift comes from going from conscious bias to conscious inclusion, which means I'm going to take action. I'm going to do something different. I'm going to build in what I call tripwires that cause me to pause before I rely on how my brain is wired to work. It doesn't happen otherwise. It really is an effort. And I always use the analogy of the gym membership. So a lot of companies right now are looking at their overall D&I space and they're like, ooh, we're a little bit unhealthy, kind of like how most of us feel at the end of December. And when do most gyms get the biggest increase in memberships? January 2nd. So that's where companies are right now. And the difference between getting the gym membership and actually showing up and doing the work of getting fit, managing your bias so that you're actually building in process steps to your, the talent practices and functions that allow leaders to catch themselves before making decisions. Because if we rely on just, once again, altruism, or people are going to do the right thing because they've learned this piece, that it doesn't happen. And that's why we've had D&I practitioners for, decades. We're still getting better at it, but we haven't cracked the nut. And I think it's part of that is due to recognizing that this is work. It isn't easy. We keep, diverse teams don't always outperform homogenous teams. They do when they're high-performing diverse teams, when they're in an environment where they can thrive. And so this kind of thing, if we just can throw some diversity together, people are all going to figure it out. No, it takes work. It is harder to engage with someone who is different than you than it is, and truly understand them, than it is to engage with people that are just like you. You're not going to get the best outputs if all you have is, homogenous thinking, but, we have to recognize that some things are harder than others and that this is work, and making it seem like, oh, well, it should just be part of our natural makeup to do this, I think is an unfair expectation.
Treasa, one of the things that I think is really interesting is this whole concept of building value propositions. And it's interesting, not just at the talent acquisition side of it, in terms of how we look at sourcing and we look at recruiting, attracting, placing, but it's also as critical in the process of, the employee life cycle too. Can you talk about value proposition for both candidate pools in terms of branding, onboarding, engagement, retention? What should we be thinking about as organizations?
So what we're thinking about and starting to have more concrete discussions so that we can build the plans around is that the employee value proposition is going to look different for different groups. And we have up to this point looked at diversity and branding as it relates to diversity in a rather narrow way. We think we've thought about, visual pictures representing our commitment to veterans and women and people of colors, and have wanted to give ourselves some credit for that. But I think the honest conversation that we're having with ourselves now is, so what's really important to women? What's really important to the Gen Zer? What's really important to the veteran? What's really important to people of color? And then, based on those importance, how are we telling them the story of us that will attract them to us, number one? And then, how are we ensuring that the experiences, once we have them here, include what they value? all through their employee life cycle. And so, I've heard it said recently is, we've got to recruit where others aren't. So HBCUs and JCs as an example, and what does that mean in terms of internships and how we want to look at internships differently? How do we want to post positions differently? How do we want to describe positions differently based on those EVPs? Who are we involving in the selection process? How are we leveraging our associate resource groups to help us frame those profiles and onboarding, and to help us with our recruitment activities, and also obviously our engagement activities? All of that is the upside. And as Kristen said, it is heavy lifting. I've signed up, and I'm encouraged that I have business leaders that are signing up for this heavy lift. But much like the tapestry analogy I was using earlier, the valuable ones take a long time to weave. Now, we've got to accelerate that, but we've got to understand that it's going to take time.
Well, it's a perfect segue really into change management. And Lance and I talked about change management. Lance, talk to us a little bit about the fact that D&I is not a fad.
No, and as Kristen was using the gym example, and I use a similar kind of fitness example when I talk about this. There's always the next new diet or the next piece of equipment or the thing you wrap around your abdomen that's going to melt the fat away, and they don't work. They don't work. And what it really comes down to is some basic fundamentals of diet and exercise. And if you sort of extend that analogy, we are personal trainers for our organization, because what it takes is some discipline and dedicated work to what you're trying to accomplish. A lot of what we talk about, particularly from the people side of inclusion and diversity, is really just good people management practices. And if you are managing your people well, if those processes are equitably applied to your population, then you'll see the diversity, the advancement, the representation that you're striving for, because you're managing well and you're creating those opportunities, and you've got the goals and the metrics in place that help you move and progress along those dimensions. So, it's great that we are in favor right now and highly sought after, but what is really more important is that, we can get into roles where our organizations are willing to put in disciplined approaches to the work that we need to do. And that's how, the moment that we're in will not be just a movement, but will actually not be a moment, but will really be a movement.
Thank you so much. We've got quite a few questions that are rolling in. I'm going to turn it over to Emily, and let's get some answers to those. Our panelists will just raise their hand if they're interested in addressing the question, and we'll dive right to you.
Thanks, Kim. So the first question that I've got says, tell me more about how you've addressed accessibility in terms of people with disabilities, and how do you stay mindful of that in the hiring programs that you kind of help create?
I think it is one of the more challenging areas of diversity and inclusion, because unlike race, ethnicity, gender, and such, those are visible. While I think most of us have a challenge in getting folks to identify their disabilities, and there's such a variety of them, and how you address someone who has problems with vision versus someone who has problems with hearing versus someone who has ambulatory problems are very different. I think in my last organization, one of the things they were exceptionally well known for was the accessibility. And it's probably because they also have a huge customer face to their business. So United Airlines, want people to travel and be able to do so in comfort and make all of their systems and tools accessible. And it literally ran the gambit of all of disability diversity, and they scored it incredibly well on the diversity disability index. I think it becomes less obvious in other organizations that may not have the same customer focus, and it kind of ends up being a secondary or tertiary type of diversity that gets attention.
Yeah, the one thing I would say is that, as Kristen mentioned, disabilities come in a whole host of descriptions, not just the ones that we can see. And I think I saw some statistic that 1 in 4 Americans, just keep it to the U.S. population, is either born with or will acquire a disability or is caring for someone with a disability. So it affects a significant portion of our population. And so whether you're figuring out ways to create access for the people who either have or have acquired those disabilities, or represent yourself as an organization that is attuned to those issues for the folks who are caring for people with disabilities. It allows you to draw on a talent pool that is grossly undertapped and underserved in our marketplace, but it also, again, creates that sort of engagement with people who are also attuned to this issue, and it creates greater connection to their organizations when they know that your company is focused on this as an issue and supports people who are dealing with these issues.
One last comment on that, if I might. I think that, as Kristen indicated and Lance amplified, it starts also with that EVP that the organization has identified with, right? So in Kristen's example, that organization had identified that as a value and then set forth in bringing that to life. And I think for the rest of us, our organizations are or will be, out of necessity, identifying that value, that internal value proposition, so that it can be an external statement in the marketplace and in the workforce.
Thank you. This question comes from Lauren Trombetta. She says, what advice would you give a hiring manager who doesn't know how to diversify an applicant pool?
All right, I saw Lance there too. So one is the partnering that they need to do with human resources and talent acquisition. And so the hiring manager may or may not be aware of their blind spots, but this is where talent acquisition can really come in and be the diversity champions and the diversity ambassadors, if you will. Anonymity to resumes is a simple tactic that can be used to help that hiring manager. Framing questions for that hiring manager that help get to valuing diversity and inclusion is a tactical way that talent acquisition can play a role. And then certainly the human resources business partner in describing what skills and experience is necessary for the role. It's conversation that we're having internally in terms of migrating away from some of the profiles that says X number of years of experience are necessary for certain roles. Is it really, and why is it, and is that as relevant today? And then to Kristen's earlier point about talent pools with a more remote workforce, the demographics should start to broaden in terms of available pools of talent if we're not looking in one specific geographic place for roles. So I think those are conversations that business partners, HR business partners, and talent acquisition professionals can have with hiring managers to help continue to educate them first, and then hold them accountable and coach them.
This next question comes from an anonymous attendee. They say, what are the best ways to build a D&I team, and what would you recommend, or would you recommend internal and external hires for that? What are your thoughts around that?
I'll chime in a little bit. To the second part, absolutely, a mix of internal and external resources, I think, is critical to forming a really effective D&I team. One, because you definitely need people who know the cultural norms and nuances of the organization, can help you navigate some of the more difficult things that you're trying to accomplish or will encounter when you do the work. But it also helps to have an external perspective, fresh eyes, different take, to bring in best practices and different ways of approaching some of the work as well. There are lots of D&I professionals, people in the space. If you just go to LinkedIn and type it in, you'll get more names than you can possibly. So there is, and that's one of the beauties about this work, is that it's a field. There are people who are dedicated, their lives to this profession and who are really expert in what they do. You find them in our organizations. You find consultants. There are external organizations that support and drive great learning in this space. So there are no lack of resources or people available to come into an organization and help you really make meaningful progress.
Well, I'll quickly add, I happen to be building a D&I team. So check out alcon.com careers, because I have a posting that is out there today. And we're going to continue to build our team. And, how do you do that? I think you have to look at what you have in your organization to start with. If D&I has been a strong competence in your organization, you may have, some folks that you, because they know the organization, will get traction very early. But if it's not something that has had a deep competence in the organization, then certainly the value of external perspective is huge. And hopefully you have the opportunity to have a team of more than one or two folks, so that you can build out that well-rounded team that can not only get traction in the organization, but bring to the table that expertise and learning from other places.
Thank you, Kristen. This question asks, more and more companies are using assessment tests as a part of the selection process, and many use the results as a kick-out versus one piece of the overall process. And what are your thoughts kind of around that topic?
I am probably generally a fan of assessments when used appropriately. And I've worked in some organizations where in high volume recruiting, assessments are essential because you need them just to manage your candidate pool. So that's, I'll set that aside, because I think the question really is more to around companies that have used assessments as a screen out versus a way to really understand sort of where a candidate or an individual possesses certain skills, traits, or characteristics that could be additive to the role or culture of the organization, and figuring out where in the recruiting process you insert assessments so that they are a data point and not a decision gate. We're actually having the same conversations right now at PVH, this exact conversation. Assessments can provide tremendous value in terms of providing greater insight into the candidates. And if you do it early enough in the process, or if it's a little bit later in the process, so as you're getting to your final candidate, to help you figure out a really great onboarding plan for that person to accelerate their success once they join. But I think what's really important about assessments is that you try to do your best to extract the bias that could filter into them depending on how they're created, so that you don't replicate or perpetuate things, but really do leverage them as a way to, as equitably as you can, assess the candidates in your pool.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, I agree 150% with everything that Lance shared, is because assessments can be super valuable, but that they are validated assessments. They've been validated and tested over large swaths of populations to ensure that there isn't bias built into them, and that they're fairly applied and consistently used. So it's more about the type of the tool and how it's used, as opposed to, I think, the value, because there is a value.
And one more point is that internal use, some verification in terms of the application. So to Lance's point, in the ideal state, they should help formulate onboarding plans and development plans for candidates, associates, employees. And so over time, then being able to paint that picture of how they've done just that.
Thank you, all three of you. This is an interesting one. How do you believe systemic racism has impacted the organizations you've worked for? And do you believe that there are common trends of systemic racism across most organizations, or mostly unique to the issues of a particular organization?
I'll take part of that question. I don't know that I have uncovered anything from a data perspective or a process perspective that indicates my organization is experiencing systemic racism. What I am identifying is that there are opportunities in the perception of that. And that's where I am leveraging our Equality Diversity Task Force and Roundtable and other leaders to help address some of those gaps. What does it look like to move one's career in the organization? And how are we moving careers for individuals in our organization? And then once we've moved people in the organization, what story does that tell us in terms of the numbers and the analyses that we use from an HR information and technology perspective? So while I know that that is a diagnostic that we should all embark on, I've not yet had the experience where that's been something that's come to fruition here, but it is something that I'm mindful of and will continue to review as we get deeper and deeper into our processes.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say is that, and it's been touched on in the conversation, if you want to understand whether or not that exists in your organization, the data is your friend. You absolutely need to see, what are the patterns, the experience patterns that you're seeing for different groups in your organization, because that could be an indicator. The other thing is that engagement surveys are really, really very helpful if your organization does it, because it'll help you understand whether people are experiencing the organization differently, and if there are cultural barriers to inclusion that exist in your organization that you can identify and address.
Thank you. This is the last question.
One more point is being visible about that data. So if you're going to do the engagement surveys, if you're going to do the culture surveys, that there is an overt sharing of the results of the survey, and those action plans that are identified are used as scorecards for how the organization is progressing, and that those are also overtly visible to the organization, because all of that is part and parcel to engagement.
Thank you. Last question. This should be for all of you. Reflecting on 2020, what are you hopeful for going into 2021 and beyond?
That's a long list. I have a personal list of things I'm hopeful for, but I'm assuming you're asking me about the space of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think my biggest wish for 2021 is that the momentum that we've seen in 2020 gets pulled through to, sustainable solutions that continue to drive, change and improvement. I think it's my biggest fear and my biggest hope.
Yeah, I will double down on that. I'm a little over 2 months in at PVH, and I'm incredibly enthused about the energy that we have in our organization around this work. And more personally, our youngest is a freshman in college who is studying remotely. So I'm very hopeful that she'll be back on campus in 2021 and beyond.
You know, my hope is that the education, the awareness, the challenging, sometimes difficult conversations will continue because I think I've witnessed that the empathy is resulting from those conversations. And, you know, the old saying, right? When we know better, we do better. And so my hope is that we're going to continue to understand how to do better and collectively hold ourselves accountable to being better.
Thank you so much. I think my hope is that we'll continue to shine a light on this. And I want to thank everyone on the panel. Thank you, Emily, for coordinating this. And thank you, everyone, for participating. Please plan to keep in touch through our networks. And we look forward to seeing all of you in another venue soon. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was such an honor. Thank you.
Awesome.
I learned a lot. Be well.
Thanks,
Same here.
Treasa.
Thanks, everyone. This was great.
Thanks, Lance. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Treasa.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you,
Emily.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
That concludes our webinar. To learn more about Centerstone Executive Search and Consulting, head to centerstonesearch.com. We provide retained search, executive assessments, executive coaching, outplacement, and organization development services for startups to Fortune 500 companies. We thank you for attending or viewing this webinar, and the Centerstone team wishes you all a wonderful fall season.